Hello, and welcome to the Power Dynamic Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Amanda Aguilera. I'm Executive Director with the Right Use of Power Institute, and I do research, writing, and facilitating in social power dynamics. In this podcast, we bring to light what often gets left in the shadows: personal, social, and systemic power dynamics. We get to have discussions with some of the most brilliant hearts and minds in fields like leadership development, diversity, equity, and belonging, conflict resolution, ethics, communication, and social action. We explore with you the nuances of the different types of power and bring to light how we can best navigate power together. Our deepest intention is to create spaces where we can collaboratively learn together what it means to use power consciously and how to move toward right relationship across difference, while also promoting well-being for ourselves and for the greater good. Before we get started, please be sure to hit the like and subscribe button so you won't miss any of our future episodes. Each episode builds on each other, so it can be helpful to follow along. And a way for you to show support for us is to leave a review wherever you're listening to this podcast. We value your feedback. So let's dive in and learn how we can transform our relationships to power and each other. So welcome, Jeff. I'm really excited to finally have a conversation with you in this format. I know we've had many conversations about power over the years, and I'd love to just start with how you came to Right Use of Power and what your journey has been with it since.
Yeah, no, it's always a pleasure to chat, and thank you for carving out the time. And the journey to Right Use of Power, I think probably like most people's, was fairly accidental. It was one of those, organic, introduced to it by a colleague who had taken the training. She was a Hakomi certified psychotherapist. She was working at one of our addiction treatment programs, where I was a supervisor of a youth addiction treatment program. And to be honest, we were really struggling at the time with reconciling what we believed to be the work of addictions treatment with what the industry was saying the work was. And so there was a tension for me and my team on how to be in right relationship with our clients when there's an inherent power dynamic that no one was really talking about. And so we have this situation where kids are going out into the woods, these teenagers are going into the woods for months at a time, and they're living in relationship and community with us and each other. And we didn't have the language to understand the power struggles that were happening, some of the resistance that was happening, and we would chalk it up to, treatment readiness was the conversation. I don't know if this client is treatment ready. And we never turned the gaze inward to say, how are we showing up as practitioners, as a program? How are we structuring this? What kind of rules and expectations are we putting in place? Are those fair? Have they been mutually created? So we're having a bit of an identity crisis because most of us came from outside of the addictions treatment field and got into it. And we looked around like, is this really it? Like, is this what we're doing here? Like, they're just binders full of psychotherapy, psychoeducational groups. And if we just run them through that, it's going to have the impact. And so long story short, Serena ran us through a kind of a half-day workshop on power. And it was the first time that the team suddenly had language to describe the experiences we were having with each other, with the funder, with our clients, and it made power visible all of a sudden. And so that kind of sparked us on a journey as a program, and me as a professional and as a person, to learn more about power. My own power, how that shows up in the world, but power more globally. And so I think I went down to Boulder and probably spent lots of time in a boardroom with Cedar and Maggie learning about power, kind of those pre-pandemic days when we used to do that more often. And then, as all good things, you get sucked in a little bit more and you find yourself on the board. And so I'm on currently the board chair of the Right Use of Power Institute, and a trainer, and it's definitely impacts my parenting and it impacts my work in lots of different ways. So that's probably the short version of that.
Wonderful. And how lucky we were that you found your way to us. And I know that you've integrated it pretty substantially into your professional life. I'd love for you to explore that a little with us.
Yeah, for sure. So, it started definitely in addictions treatment and starting to see addiction and all of the things that fall out from kind of addiction and mental health as fundamentally related to power. Right. And this kind of all roads lead to power mantra started to form for me. And then I started to look into other spaces. My wife's a teacher, looking into the education system, looking deeper into healthcare, looking into corporate spaces, and seeing all of these dynamics that are fundamentally rooted in power, but aren't being addressed as such. They're being addressed individually. We tackle employee burnout or employee engagement or, client experience in the hospital, all of these things as if they're somehow disconnected from a fundamental conversation about who has power, how do they get it, how do they understand it, how are they using it, how does it show up in relationship, what are other people's perspectives of it, what happens when you have a power differential, like all of these things. And right use of power gave a map for a lot of those conversations and some of the frameworks and tools to hold on to when we wade into those often pretty ambiguous conversations and shifting dynamic conversations. The Power Dynamic podcast is why we're here today. And it's such a dynamic force that, we could go down that rabbit hole, but how it shows up for me in my current work. So currently a co-CEO of the Ally Co., which is a small consulting group that's really focused on kind of team function, employee experience, and leadership, and how to close what we call the intention impact gap. And so leaders who are having impacts that are disconnected from their underlying intentions, that's kind of a fundamental place that we spend a lot of time. And the conversation about power, helping leaders understand their power and see the responsibility that comes with that power, and how people might actually be responding more to power than to personality. And some of those, those things, we start to unpack or uncouple some of the belief systems that exist in the mainstream and start to ask those questions. How might this be a reflection of power dynamics? And that opens up a whole new territory for conversation and for leaders to do different work in more meaningful ways.
That sounds really fascinating, and I'm sure there's got to be some pushback when you start to introduce the concept and even the word power. So I wonder how
power can be scary.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah. And to be honest, not every leader, not every team is ready to have the conversation about power. There's still a lot of, I think, fear around power. I've had leaders straight up say, I don't want this conversation to happen on my team. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with control, right? Yeah. And fear and control kind of go hand in hand with each other. We used to say in addictions treatment that control is actually the master addiction. When we want to control for an outcome, that's the thing that we're actually most attached to underneath all of it, right? And so leaders who are in a fear-based place and who default to control probably are not going to enjoy a conversation about like making power more visible on their teams. Because when you make power more visible, you see the misuses and abuses of power. Even if they're unintentional and accidental, they come to the surface and are seen in a different way. But also without that conversation, you don't have the opportunity to rehabilitate your relationship with power or your team's relationship with power. And so it does take a certain level of consciousness, awareness, willingness to dive into those types of conversations. We talk to leaders, there's awareness, there's willingness, and there's skill. And we can help you with the awareness and the skill, but you have to bring the willingness. And so that's a caveat, I think, for leaders who are if they want to do deeply transformative work, there has to be a willingness there to engage in uncomfortable conversations. It's super cliche because everybody's like, lean into the discomfort, lean into the, all of this stuff. But it's true. There has to be a willingness to be wrong, to not have the right answers, to be suddenly aware of impacts that you weren't aware of before, and to work through that as an individual, but also as a team. And so team readiness, leader willingness, those are two pretty important ingredients for those who are really looking to shift culture or shift experience.
And for those who are willing to kind of go in that direction and start the conversation around power, I'd love to hear more about how you lead that conversation and kind of what types of power you look at together.
Yeah. How do we lead that conversation? I think that we start with the assumption that we actually don't know anything about what's happening in the system. And that's actually a really helpful place, this really grounded, genuinely curious place of, I actually don't know. Like I've heard usually by the time we come into a system, we've been hired to come in and do some culture assessment work or some trusted advising work or something. We've probably only talked to one or two or three people in that system. And so we have a snapshot. We have a piece of the perspective that exists. Our very first job is to get as many perspectives as we need to have a more complete understanding of what the actual perspective is. on the workplace experience. And so I'm actually in interviews this week with a client. There's a leadership team of 10, and each of them we're going to talk to each of them for 30 to 45 minutes with a set of questions, and we're going to ask them, and then we're going to compile those answers, and we'll pull the themes out. And then we talked with the team about the themes, not the individual experiences. And some people will be aligned with those core themes, and some people might be a little bit misaligned. But at the end of the day, they will have all had their voices heard in the system, and we'll all have an opportunity to co-define what the actual problem or opportunity is. I think that's a missing piece with, usually power is something we do to people. It's like we define what the problem is with the culture, and we come in and solve it. And we might be HR, might be the CEO, it might be whoever is tasked with that. And when we shift the work from doing it to people to doing it with them, that's just a shift in the power dynamic. So we actually don't prescribe problems and solutions. We come to the table and say, here's what we've heard. Let's make sense of it together. And we do this session called the Making Feedback Meaningful session, where we take all the feedback that we've heard from the system and we just put it squarely in front of the leadership team or whoever has the power to affect change. And we say, now what? Let's make sense of this together. And let's then move into solutioning. I think we move too quick through problem identification into solutioning. And when we do that, we risk misusing our power, because all it takes is for us to misdiagnose the problem. And all of a sudden, any solutions, any resources we throw at it downstream are actually misaligned with what the team actually needs and what's going to make the most difference. And so a little bit of that slow is smooth is fast kind of mentality when it comes to this type of work is important.
So you mentioned leadership teams. Do you also work with the rest of the staff, like the folks who are what we call down power?
Yes. And we've found that it has to happen in sequence. It has to, you have to work with the people with power first and foremost. Otherwise you risk actually creating further tension and gaps inside of organizations. I think that's a fundamental. If somebody's listening to this, if you're a leader and you're taking one thing out of this podcast, take this, is that the leadership team has to be a half a step or more ahead of the rest of the organization when it comes to culture change or shifting expectations, when it comes to behavior, whatever it is you're trying to affect. If the leadership team is not on board and ahead of the game, and they're playing catch up, they're going to be accidentally undoing a lot of the work. And I actually had this conversation in the fall with a client around, hired to come in and do middle management and supervisor type training. It's like, okay, that's great. Can help with that. And what are you doing to support that? And what are you doing accidentally and unintentionally that might undo it? Right? If we're not also having that conversation, then we risk actually just magnifying existing gaps or having this imbalance start to occur where we expect things of middle management or direct contributors that so being held to higher standards than people who are in up power positions. And that's a shadow side of power we could talk about probably, is that happens quite regularly.
Yes.
As a parent, I know I have higher expectations of my kids on certain things than I do of myself, if I'm truly honest. And so it happens, but we need to guard against that. And we need to be really thoughtful about how we approach change in organizations. And for us, that means all roads lead to power and leadership, which means starting there with any change and then figuring out how to cascade it or how to roll it out in the rest of the organization.
Yeah, I feel like that's particularly true in the diversity, equity, inclusion world. I've worked in that position where I had a certain amount of role power, but my task was to help shift the organization to a more equitable place. And a lot of organizations experience this, and it's a very frustrating position because the leadership the leadership above you want you to do all the work and make the change in the organization, but they're not willing to do it. And it just never works. It never works. And for them to do that level of work, because a lot of them are white and a lot of them are cis and a lot of them are, I think, it's challenging. So I think it's a really good point, particularly in that space.
Yeah, and we've found that it ultimately boils down to this kind of ways of working. Like, do the ways of working reflect and reinforce the values and vision of the organization? Often there's a lot of tension in that, or there's a disconnect between what organizations say is important, the values on the wall, and then the behaviors in the boardroom or the behaviors on the Zoom calls in the emails. It's like, hey, there's a fundamental gap or a disconnect here, and that's going back to that, fear-based place. If leaders are coming at their work from a place of fear and scarcity, it's going to affect their behavior. And that behavior is often, collaboration is a great example. I haven't met a leader yet who says no more collaboration. Like, we've got enough collaboration happening. Usually it's, maybe occasionally, but usually it's like we don't have nearly enough collaboration. Right? And then you look at the incentives, you look at the fear in the systems, you look at the turf protection and the siloing and all of the things, and you're like, well, like, are we surprised by this? Like, of course we don't, because we haven't set ourselves up with our ways of working, and we don't reinforce those expectations very fluidly or very intentionally. And so I think a lot of the downstream, what we find is we'll get the call because there's a conflict in an organization, and I'm sure you're the same. You get the call when the symptom is burning so hot, or the fire is burning so hot, and that draws a lot of resources and attention to try and put that fire out. And if you back up a few steps, it's like, well, there's a tension here. There's a missing piece between what we say is important and how we're behaving. And maybe it's support, or maybe it's accountability. Who knows what? It's probably a combination of the two. But most teams are so stuck in that reactive firefighting mode that they don't put their head up and look longer term and say, hey, actually, if we do it this way, this is going to have a better outcome. And so I could talk all day. We could dig into all of these things, but I felt like that's a little bit of a bunny trail.
Yeah, there's a lot of those with power. You mentioned this like intention impact gap, and I know that there's a lot there. I'm curious if you'd want to expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, there is a lot there. And I think that why don't we start with the fact that it's probably actually not a gap between intentions and impacts. It's more likely a gap between intention and action. Right? Because there's a middle piece. We say intention impact. You heard that language quite often in the space, but there's actually there's things that happen in between our intention and our impact. And there's two kind of ingredients that I see. There's intention, and then there's attention or focus, and then there's action, and then there's impact. Right? And leaders can't actually control for impact in most instances, because impact is experienced by other people, right? Or it's the downstream. It happens after the action. So what leaders can actually control is the attention. What am I actually focused on? And my action that follows. And usually action follows attention. If you're driving down the road and you look in the ditch, suddenly you're veering over towards the ditch, right? There's that, like, we drive where we look, right? Or we steer where we look. And that's the same with our behavior as leaders, is we behave based on what we're paying attention to or focused on. Right? And so if we're focused on the mistakes that in someone's presentation, we're going to zoom in on all of the mistakes in the presentation, and we're going to be critical of them, and our feedback is going to be critical in nature. Right? If we zoom out and we want to see, like, what's the story being told here, and it's an amazing story and that hasn't been told before, we're going to see that, and we're going to praise that person for the story they're telling, and we're going to look past the typos or whatever it is that's drawing our attention. So where we put our attention, our action follows, and that's probably how to close the intention impact gap for leaders, is actually what are the actions and behaviors that are aligned or misaligned with the intention. And most leaders don't get feedback on their actions because of the power dynamic, right? And they also don't intentionally set intentions, right? They don't have the space and the mental clarity to come into a meeting saying, here's my intention for this meeting. Here's what I hope to get out of it. Moment to moment, we have to be aware of our intentions. And so that's where a lot of that work actually lives, is helping create feedback pathways for the actions that leaders are taking and the impact that's having on people, right? We could talk about that, and also helping people connect the dots between their values, the things they say are important, and their moment-to-moment intentions, and then paying attention to those. And so that intention impact gap is actually, there's more moving parts there than just those two, and I think making that visible for starters is really helpful. But then we need the pathways, particularly for the feedback, right? Because most people, when faced with, here's your values and here's your behavior, one of them needs to change because there's a misalignment here. Right. Most of us, when faced with that choice, change our behavior more easily and more readily and reliably than changing our values. At least that's been my experience.
And sometimes the values need to change, like that double loop learning. Yeah,
for sure. And sometimes the values that we say are important aren't the real values, right? We might be valuing our own personal safety and security over innovation and growth. For instance, if it's innovation and growth on the board, but we're getting pressure to maintain profit margins or whatever it is and not make mistakes, then we're going to, like, our values are going to be what's truly important, not what we say is important. So sometimes there is a tension or a gap there, but I would say that we're always operating from a place of values. They're sometimes just unknown to us, or haven't been explicitly put on the table, right? But it's the thing that I'm caring about, right? And it might be self-protection, it might be who knows what.
That's really helpful to break it down in that way and give people something to work with, because intention and impact, it's like, it feels like there's little control there. It's like, well, I had this intention, and it's unfortunate that there was this impact.
It's unfortunate that it's that classic leader apology. I'm sorry you felt like, or I'm sorry you felt that way. It's like, actually, what were the actions that contributed to that impact?
Yeah. And at the same time, it feels like you could have all the skills and awareness in the world, and still there might be an impact that you weren't intending, even if your actions were aligned with your values. Just because we can't possibly know someone else's experience, we can't possibly, and so even when it doesn't make sense to us, and even when things were aligned, that impact is still important. And I feel like there's a lot of pushback I experience around that.
It's my pal Steve it's called the $1 billion question. Steve DeGroot, and it's, what do I know about this, whatever this happens to be, from their perspective? So what do I know about the impact of this email I just sent from the perspective of the person on the receiving end? When we ask ourselves that question, the answer is nothing. Like 99% of the time, we actually don't know what their perspective is. And so part of closing that intention impact gap is actually the practice of deep listening, right? It's the ability to set aside your own ego, your own perspective, your own opinions on whatever it is, your own intentions, and actually just deeply listen to the experience or the perspective of someone else, and not to hold it as truth, but as a truth, and to be able to sit with it and be like, yeah, that makes sense to me. I can see how that happened. And maybe that's all it is. Like, sometimes that's all it is that people need. I know when I've had crappy impacts from people in positions of power, if they had just actually listened to the concerns, and then maybe we make a plan, maybe we shift into dialogue and we talk about what to do next time. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of impact goes unnoticed and unheard. And I think that that's going back to why all of our work starts with discovery. It's so that all voices that are impacted in the system can have a chance to contribute to what the experience is, so that we're not always working from the perspective of, like you said, the white, cis, let's face it, male leader in most of our organizations, right? Like, that becomes the dominant perspective and the dominant narrative. And then we wonder, why our psychological safety numbers are low, why our employee engagement numbers are low, why inclusion is low, right? Why burnout is up, like all of these things. Again, back to that all roads lead to power and leadership conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I keep thinking of status power, race and gender and all of the things that are play kind of second to the role power often in professional contexts. And it's really, a lot of the impacts have to do with status power. And so if you have all the leadership that's of a certain identity or identities, it's an interesting thing where you can only put yourself in someone else's shoes to a certain degree. Like, if you think about a queer Black woman who's down power from a white cis man, he can try to take the perspective, right? But without that historical context of oppression, it's hard to do that, which is why representation and leadership matters, which is why, and not to discount listening and not to discount that at all. But also, there's only a certain amount of distance you can go.
For sure. And there's how do we distribute power more equitably in organizations? Right. There's a big conversation there, because power tends to consolidate in positions or in groups, like you said, or, there's lots of power dynamics in organizations. And like you said, lots of rabbit holes and nuances that we could get into. But I think that making power more visible and making the impact of that power on the actual lived experience of the people that we're there to support, whether that's our employees, our customers, our clients, whoever, the different stakeholders that are involved. If we can make that power more visible and the impact more visible and transparent, then we can hold power accountable for that impact in ways that we currently can't in systems. Like, most of our systems are structured in ways that people with the least amount of accountability are the people with the most amount of power. And that is a paradox that we have to fix. It is way easier to be held accountable when you are down power, right? Because the systems, how often does the CEO get put on a performance improvement plan?
Right.
PIP. It's like never.
Right. Never.
Right? Like, I don't think I've ever heard of that. Right? Maybe. I'll put the caveat out there that it's possible, but who gets put on PIPs? And it's usually not the middle management, right? Or it's usually not people with power. It's usually people who are underperforming in their roles as individual contributors are most likely to find themselves on a performance improvement plan. So even just looking at some of the structures and mechanisms that we have in place for accountability inside of organizations, I think that's a great starting point for most leadership teams. Is how are we actually in an hour or so, I'm helping facilitate a calibration session amongst the leadership team about performance, and we're making performance in the organization more visible to all leaders, and all leaders can be curious about how we're assessing performance with different people in different positions, and that's an effort to make it more visible, right? And so I think that's a big piece of the conversation.
Hey there, listeners. As we talk about leadership and using power well, I want to pause and let you know about a new program we're offering at the Right Use of Power Institute. If you're navigating challenging interpersonal dynamics from a leadership position and want to engage with your team with deeper awareness, skill, and integrity, I encourage you to check out the Power Conscious Authentic Leadership Program. We've found that integrating the right use of power concepts and practices into our approach to leadership strengthens our ability to lead with integrity and empathy by enhancing access to our personal power and acknowledging the impact that role and status power have on all of our interactions. And that's what the Power Conscious Authentic Leadership Program is all about. Whether you're a seasoned executive or just starting out, this unique program offers valuable tools to help you lead with more presence and power consciousness. The program includes live interactive learning sessions, real-world case studies, and small group coaching sessions to support your growth and development. What's more, you'll become a part of a community of like-minded leaders who are committed to making a positive difference. If this resonates with you, I encourage you to join us in exploring power dynamics, creating cultures of belonging, and inspiring our teams and communities to achieve great things together. Seats are limited, so consider taking this opportunity to transform your leadership journey. To find out more and register for the Power Conscious Authentic Leadership Program, visit www.rightuseofpower.org. You can also check out the show notes for a direct link to register. We hope to see you there. And now, back to our show.
Maybe the
Such an important conversation. What's that?
The TLDR on that, is that power, misuses of power, tend to perpetuate in the shadows, where we can't see them, where we're not talking about them visibly. And so part of the work of rehabilitating power in organizations is making the dynamic as visible as possible and as transparent. Doesn't mean eliminating it, right? I don't think we're in that world where we're going to eliminate. I don't think necessarily we even want to. I've said this before, and this is probably something I took from Cedar, is that a power dynamic is a good thing. That's where healing happens. That's where growth happens. That's where learning happens, mentorship, all the great things that we want happen inside of power dynamics, right? And yet that's also where the misuses and abuses happen. And so we just need to work to rehabilitate how we approach power and how visible it is in our systems to ensure that it aligns, the power we have aligns, the impact aligns with the intentions and all that good stuff that we've already kind of talked about a little bit. But
yeah, the power dynamics within a structure and also the structure itself, right? Which is a whole other, we could get into systemic power. I
just listened to a podcast, a Stanford professor, I'll forget his name, but he wrote a book called The 7 Rules of Power. And as I was listening to this podcast, I was like, yeah, these rules only apply in the structure that we currently have. Like these are the rules of a system, but we're not acknowledging that they're a part of a system. And I think that that's a big piece of the conversation. And I'm thrilled to see the Right Use of Power Institute leading that conversation around collective power and systemic power, and how does that show up, and how do we even conceive of the rules of the power dynamics in the first place. A lot of it's baked in to a lot of the mindsets and paradigms that are problematic, if we're honest. And so yeah, there's a big conversation to be had there. But every time I see a LinkedIn post about how someone picked themselves up by their bootstraps and had lots of resilience and made it through all of their life trauma to be a successful entrepreneur, I'm like, there goes that capitalism system doing its thing.
Yeah.
Telling a narrative that reinforces the values of the system.
Right. And we're just constantly recreating those structures, just without knowing it. We're all participating in that. It's it's a pretty interesting thing when you start to get into systemic power. That's a huge rabbit hole. I don't know if we want to go in that direction.
Well, I mean, we can. It's up to you. Mm-hmm. Where do you feel drawn to?
Well, I know you have so much expertise and experience in professional spaces working with role power, and I know you're doing some pretty, I would say, cutting edge things in the consulting world, because you are beginning the conversation about power and teaching people how to have the conversation about power within these professional contexts. And I know you have all of these like ahas in that process of the things that you see that a lot of people are doing in consulting, or a lot of people are doing to try to improve leadership or anything like that. What do you see that's working or not working?
Ooh, that's a big question, and probably a good one to spend some time on. What do I see that's not working? Why don't we start there, because that's probably more visible to me, because I tend to be pretty skeptical. And so I have this, I forget, it was a systems professor of mine way back in the day who said, all models are flawed and some are useful.
Yeah.
All models are flawed, some are useful. And that's really stuck with me, because it's true. A model is not a perfect representation of the thing that it's built to represent. It just can't be, right? The map is not the territory. There's lots of metaphors for this type of conversation. Even when we look at the Right Use of Power framework, it's not power. It's a representation of power. It's language to describe power. It's not the actual lived experience that you and I have with power on a moment-to-moment basis. And so with that caveat, there's a lot of models that have become kind of taken as truth. And so anything, these... what's not working? What's not working is a very, I call it hyper-individualized approach to what are inherently relationship problems or relationship issues. So we take individuals and we extract them from their power dynamic. We extract them from the lived experience they're having, and we try and work with them on the side. And so that can be individual one-to-one counseling, right? Or in my case, a good chunk of my career was addictions treatment. So that's taking a young person out of their context, actually physically relocating them to the woods for 3 months, where they rehabilitate themselves somehow, and then they go back into a system that hasn't changed at all. How successful is that, do we think? I can tell you it's not that successful, but it happens over and over and over again. And it's the individualization of what are collective challenges, what are relational phenomenon. Same thing happens in corporate spaces when Jim needs some support for his management, and we take Jim out of his team and we give him an executive coach, and he meets with that executive coach once, like an hour a month or 2 hours a month, and has a bunch of conversations working on his skills, and he gets back into a system, and that system is not adjusted. That system is not shifted to accommodate new approaches. And so one of two things happens. Jim gets fed up and leaves, because now it's a system problem, because he's working on himself, but the system's not changing, right? Or more likely, he reverts back to the old behaviors that are reinforced by the system that hasn't shifted. And so when you look at this individualized approach to learning and development, individualized approach to leadership development, anything that is take this person and give them a bunch of individual knowledge or skills or anything and expect them to then go and change the system with that, I would say is not working. Because we've been doing it for 40, 50 years, right? All the way back to like Outward Bound in the 50s, taking people out into the woods individually, and then they go back. And so, like, sure, we'll get lots of stories of individual transformation in that, but that's actually a reflection of a system that values individualization over collective action. So it actually just accidentally reinforces this system of individualization, right? Which doesn't contribute to actual root problem fixes, which are structural in nature or systemic in nature. And so that's probably my biggest pet peeve, is anything that's aimed at kind of you as an individual, because it views power very narrowly. It says power is your personal power, maybe a bit of your role power. And if we just get you really skilled with those two types of power, then you can go and affect change for yourself. And actually, just listening to this podcast the other day about these 7 rules of power, that's, I think, what was rubbing me the wrong way, was that it was a set of rules entirely geared towards an individual getting access to power, keeping that power, using that power for their own gain. It's like, that's probably like, that's a mindset around power that needs to shift, but it shows up in a lot of our learning and development and a lot of our kind of the narrative around that. So that's probably the biggest one. When it comes to consulting, I think I alluded to it earlier, is that kind of doing things with teams versus to them. Oftentimes consultants get hired to come in and do things to an organization. And then when it comes to actually executing on it or implementing it, there's no buy-in. Right? We're surprised that people aren't bought in to whatever change is being promoted, right? Or support from various positions of power, right? And so we get this kind of, classic example. HR does an employee engagement survey. That employee engagement survey comes back and says, hey, we should do these 3 initiatives. And then the CFO is like, well, that's too expensive, right? So do the marginalized version of one of those things, and we'll say we did something, right? And it becomes a checkbox exercise as opposed to an actual transformation of culture. And so that coming alongside initially the leadership team to understand what they see, what their perspective is, getting that information from the organization, and then working to close the gap between expectations and reality in some cases, right? And co-creating what comes next with as many people as are necessary to make that change sustainable. So sometimes you don't have to work with the entire organization. Sometimes it truly is a leadership phenomenon, and we need to fix that and get the buy-in and move that forward. And but if we're going to roll change out to the organization that they haven't had a hand in contributing to their feedback, and they haven't had a say in what might be a meaningful solution, and we expect that we're going to create that and then just like push it into an organization, it's that whole doing things to people. I always say people don't resist change; they resist being changed. Right? They resist change being done to them. Right? We're all more than capable of and honestly changing all the time. Right? But we're doing it alongside, or we're doing it with, or we're doing it because it's being driven by something meaningful to us. Right? So if we can access that, if we can tap into that as leaders and as consultants, then that's where the growth is. That's where the impact is. So those are probably the 2 big ones. If it's a hyper-individualized approach, probably not going to have much of an impact. And if it's being forced on or done to organizations, even with the best of intentions, right? Again, it's going to be experienced in an entirely different way. Flips. And
the context, and the context you're referring to is like changing culture, changing systems, and the individualized approach to changing culture, changing systems doesn't work. Essentially,
I think that when you zoom out a little bit and you look at the data on employee burnout, employee engagement, employee satisfaction, like any of these kind of surface level indicators, right? We've moved the needle in the wrong direction now for decades, at least in North America. And I would say probably in Europe as well, like Western culture has not done a good job of fixing the actual employee experience, and which is a reflection of the culture, right? And inclusion and belonging and all of the things that, we say are important. Innovation, I just read something the other day about innovation in big corporations is at an all-time low, right? And so when we ask, do you want more innovation and more belonging and inclusion and more psychological safety and satisfaction, like how is this actually working for us, is a question. And from a sector perspective, if we zoom out and if we're honest with ourselves as consultants and trainers, we have not done a good job of making it meaningful to employees, and we keep just doing a lot of the same thing, that, again, good intentions disconnected from the impact. And so as practitioners a few years ago, we had to step back and say, okay, how are we going to be accountable for the impacts that we have? Yeah. And we tell clients, like, now that we know these things exist, we're complicit in creating the conditions for them to exist unless we do something differently. So we're going to do something differently, and it's going to feel different, and it's going to be experienced differently, but at the end of it, we're going to have a different impact. And so part of that's us taking ownership and responsibility. And I think as consultants, it's too easy to come in, do your research, put your slide deck together, dust your hands off, and move on to the next project, and not stick around for the long-term impact. And so we make a commitment to our clients. We're going to be there through the change process, and we're going to come alongside you as advisors, and we're going to work together to make this change sustainable, because that's the impact we want to have in the world. And so it's us stepping into recognizing how much power we have as consultants and advisors to leaders to actually impact the experience people are having.
Yeah. Yeah. And, in our curriculum, we teach that collective power is the only thing that can change systemic power. And yet we don't have the skills for collective power because we're never taught those. We're not even taught that collective power is really a thing apart from like voting or, which a lot of people have lost faith in. But the concept, the actual practical lived experience of collective power, I think, is largely missing in all areas, including the professional context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge growth area for all of us. Like you say, we have not learned, we've learned the individualized power kind of framework, either explicitly or implicitly, just because we've experienced it, right? But few of us have. It's why group projects in university are so hard, right? I've got a friend who's doing a master's degree right now, and he's complaining about all the group projects because collectively, they just can't figure it out. And so they default into, okay, who's running this show, right? Who's in charge of this? And without the structures and the systems in place and the practice of being in a circle instead of in a lines and boxes, which is most org charts, right? How do we actually do that? There's some great models out there, the sociocracies and the holocracies and, the ocracy kind of organizational structure, but they're challenging to implement. In a lot of ways, we've seen lots of clients struggle with that, especially in the NGO space. Kind of that ethic aligns, right, with doing it that way, but like you said, don't have the muscle memory or the practice to actually affect change with that. And so we're finding more and more of a lot of our clients, we're building blended approaches, where it's like, where can we distribute power and be more sociocratic with it, and where do we need actually clear lines? I think I think Cedar says lines and circles, right? Is probably the new org chart of the future, is how do we do that? So that's an entire podcast with somebody much smarter than me around sociocracy or some of those things. Yeah,
totally. But that's really what you're pointing to, when I hear you talking about this hyper-individualized approach, which is a direct result of how systems are structured right now in dominant culture. Yeah, we're in a challenging time for many different reasons, but also because I feel like there's this shift happening to a place that we don't have the skills to get to, and or the awareness or the experience. And
yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with, or if the listeners will be familiar with this framework. It's called the Cynefin framework. It's a Welsh word. I'll find the resources and you can put it in the show notes, or you can dig into it. It's a map. It's a kind of a problem map. It's around complexity and visibility of problems. And there's obvious problems, and there's complicated problems, there's complex, and then there's chaotic. And a lot of the world is feeling pretty chaotic. COVID's a great example of a chaotic problem. We did not have best practices. We did not know how to handle that. I think political instability, I think, all of these, war and famine and economics and all of these things are in this chaotic domain, which means we need to act and then make sense of what happens when we act, because our action has a reaction inside the system, right? And I think that there's a bit of a paralyzed when I look at world leaders and I look at corporate leaders and nobody's taking action. Who's taking action to solve these problems? And there's that fear-based place again, is that if I act and I don't like the response. What do I do? It's like, well, if you don't act and nothing changes, then what do you do? And that's what a lot of leaders like. We don't act and employees continue to burn out. Then what? Right? And we don't think long-term enough. And so as soon as we zoom out a little bit and get a bit more of a time horizon, it's like, oh, these chaotic and complex problems actually require us to either act and see what happens, or to probe the system, like to poke at it to see what's there. And oftentimes that's our initial job, if I'm honest, as consultants, is we come in and we poke the system just to see what's there. What's the response of leadership if we start asking these types of questions?
Right.
Do they get defensive? And if they get defensive, what does that suggest they actually care about? Probably their security or safety more than the growth. So then we have to stop, we have to pause and zoom out a little bit and have that conversation. And say, it seems like this team is really at risk around something. What are we feeling at risk about? And what's the likelihood of that happening? And do we need to focus our energy there instead of growth? And if so, that's fine, but let's be honest about it. Let's not say we want innovation and growth and change if what we actually want is security, stability, and status quo. Because then we're just setting ourselves up, us as consultants up, your team up for, missed expectations or, the impact of that. And so getting to alignment on what's actually here and what are we here to do, I think is really important. And I think a lot of teams kind of hustle through that step sometimes, or don't give it the space it needs.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that is unfortunately foreign to a lot of people is accountability, or the ability and skill around what it means to take active responsibility. Because once you zoom out and see that you haven't been taking action, or once the system is poked and you see kind of the impacts, I think a lot of people just don't know how to take responsibility. We have so much punitive relationship with responsibility, so people are scared to do it. And here we come around to psychological safety again, but I think that's it's an important piece in all of this.
Yeah. There's a rehabilitation required in lots of spaces, but when it comes to our relationship with power in positions of authority and leadership in roles where we are accountable, like you said, or responsible for the impact, I think we have to start there. Like, it has to be a primary part of the conversation is what is our actual impact? Let's see if that aligns or misaligns with our intentions, and then let's get into the gap in between, which is our actions, what we're actually doing, right? And do that differently. Show up in ways and be open to the feedback. I think that's the missing ingredient in most organizations, is some sort of feedback loop that is useful and short enough to actually give that kind of corrective and positive feedback because we want to also reinforce, most of the teams we talk to, unfortunately, don't have great celebration and recognition muscles either. Right?
Yeah.
They're not spending the time on, hey, that really aligned well with our intentions. That was our value in action, and let's celebrate that. And I've seen the power of that. We shifted gears in addictions treatment, and for the last few years that I was there, we made a habit of consistently and constantly celebrating and acknowledging alignment with values, and it deepened the team's connection to those values, and it shifted practice in ways that probably nothing else really came close to the actual impact of that practice. We could see it in action because we were, again, you steer where you look. And so if you're looking for signs of your values in action, you'll see them. If you're looking for signs of gaps and tension and conflict, you'll see that too, right? And I think that we want leaders to see both and be able to address both, or kind of be with both in a meaningful way. So, like you said, lots of rabbit holes, lots of opportunities.
Yeah,
to
but
dig in,
such good ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, such good rabbit holes. And yeah, I think the celebration piece too, culturally, we're not very good at it. Not very good at it.
We celebrate the big milestones, right? The birthdays, the once a year. We're good at the once a year celebration of something.
Right.
When it's like, what can we celebrate from this podcast that we just recorded? What can we celebrate from this meeting that we just finished, or this quarterly strat planning session, or that client session we had 2 weeks ago? And so one of the things, an actionable takeaway for listeners is to debrief everything. We debrief everything at the Outlet Go, right? And so I run a session, I call one of the team members on the way home, and they ask me what went well, wouldn't it be better if, and what's next? Or some version of those 2 or 3 questions. It takes 10 minutes, and it extracts the learning from the experience that we just had, and then we can adjust and we can shift. And that's that's what leadership is in a lot of cases, is creating the pathway for that feedback so that you can be better, even slightly better, the next time you go to do that thing, right? Whatever better looks like. It's not about being the best, it's about being better. And that better, if it's aligned with values, it's more collaborative, or it's more inclusive, or it's whatever, right? It's connected back again to what you and the team cares about.
So good. Well, I celebrate you, Jeff, and all the good work that you're doing in the world. Yeah, I'm so excited to see you using part of what you've learned in right use of power and just kind of ran with it, and it's just blossoming in these beautiful ways. It's lovely to see.
I appreciate the feedback and celebrations and recognition right back at you. It's very exciting to see the Right Use of Power Institute on the growth trajectory that it is, and having the impact in all the spaces. And so if we can contribute in a small way to that in the spaces that we're in, then great. But I can see, when you say blossoming or flourishing, I can see the Right Use of Power Institute and all the great work and thinking and heart that's going into moving that forward in the world. And that's a lot of your leadership. So appreciate it. And thanks for the chat. I'll have to do it again.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Jeff. Thank you for listening to the Power Dynamic Podcast. If you'd like to follow along, remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next episodes. You can also find out more about the Right Use of Power Institute at www.rightuseofpower.org, or you can like us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or TikTok. At the Institute, feedback is always welcome. We appreciate feedback that is generative, meaning that it will help us to stretch and grow, but also avoids destructive commentary. To submit your feedback, please email feedback@rightuseofpower.org, or feel free to leave us a review. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by guests do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of the Right Use of Power Institute, nor are they an endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service. The material and information presented here is for general educational purposes only and does not constitute advice or services. Some episodes of the Power Dynamic Podcast include a transcript of the episode's audio. The text is the output of AI-based transcribing from an audio recording. Although the transcription is largely accurate, in some cases it is incomplete or inaccurate due to inaudible passages or transcription errors, and should not be treated as an authoritative record. We welcome you to download and play the podcast and share with others for personal use. Please acknowledge the Power Dynamic Podcast as the source of the material. You may not rebroadcast, distribute, or commercially exploit any portion of the content, except with our express written consent. The Power Dynamic Podcast is produced exclusively by the Right Use of Power Institute. All rights reserved.